Okay. Hi, I'm Kristen Cantu, and I am joined here by Sarah Rosenthal and Ryan Stanton. We are here on behalf of Montpelier-Roxbury Public Schools Partners in Education Group, which is an organization that works with the parent groups of each school in the Montpelier-Roxbury School District to identify areas of need. Back in March, when the COVID-19 crisis began, the MRPS Partners in Education conducted a survey of family needs, and we heard loud and clear that families were seeking a way to connect with each other and support each other during this time of physical separation. We began brainstorming this project with families and therapists in our community, and little did we know that the isolation would continue and episodes of social injustice would add to our collective anxiety. We conducted a parent survey and have received anonymous questions via Google form, which we will link with this video. And we'll continue accepting questions, posting videos, and answering all of your questions as we can, and providing additional tips and advice for families during this time. But right now, I would like to introduce our two therapists that will be addressing some questions from our community during this interview session. First, I'd like to welcome Sarah Rosenthal, whose interest in counseling started with a passion to help children and teens during challenging times. Over the last 20 years, she's worked in child welfare, community mental health clinics, public schools, and in outpatient counseling. Additionally, she's taught college-level social work and psychology courses and led workshops for parents and professionals. Currently, Sarah provides outpatient therapy to children, youth, and young adults and their parents. Clients generally come to Sarah when they need assistance with managing anxiety, improving social skills, developing strategies to manage learning differences, and address identity issues. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
I'd also like to welcome Ryan Stanton, a local clinical social worker and co-parent of 2 children in Montpelier schools. Ryan has worked as a therapist for the past 12 years in the public and private sector, in social services, in community mental health, and in college counseling and private practice. He's worked with adolescents, adults, and families, and is focused largely on helping folks with their general mental health and wellness, addictions, and trauma. Ryan uses he, him pronouns and is a white male working on becoming a more consistent anti-racist ally. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you.
Sarah and Ryan, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And just so everyone knows, all of the questions I will be asking them come from parents in our community. And Ryan, the first question I'm going to direct towards you. My kids have expressed that they feel like they are living in a dream. We're all feeling untethered. How do we stay grounded right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been actually, I've really appreciated the opportunity to reflect on the questions that folks have posed, and both relating as a parent and as a human going through this really interesting and in some ways unprecedented time of heightened anxiety and uncertainty. And then as a therapist as well, and I have the opportunity, and I feel humbled in the work to be able to listen to people's stories and to try to create a space where folks can do their own work to move forward on their goals for themselves, and to find ways to be grounded and resourced and tackle the tough questions that people are dealing with in a way that works for them. So it's a little funny to speak generally for me. I'm much more used to speaking individually and one-on-one with folks, and really not being the person with the answers or the expert in any way, but really sort of creating a space for folks to sort through this, whatever they need to on their own with me. I think this idea of untethered and groundedness is a concept that is pretty universal, and I'm hearing a lot of, and actually experiencing some of, and I've just to normalize that we are feeling untethered in a lot of ways, and what we've been used to dealing with is changing. We've got all kinds of curveballs coming at us left and right, and it's unsettling. And the uncertainty and the impermanence that's always present seems somehow much more front and center right now for folks. And so to just sort of name that, normalize it. And I've been, I think, having an appreciation for our ability to tune into our own experience and to really try to drop down from the left brain sort of intellectual, rational understanding of what's happening into our bodies, and to feel into what we're experiencing emotionally and physically, as well as to try to make some sense out of what's happening intellectually. So this idea of being tethered and grounded, from my perspective, really starts with attuning to our own experience, and feeling into our own experience, making space for what our own experience is, and getting a sense, sort of what our typical baseline is, how we, the normal ups and downs that we might have experienced prior to COVID-19, and the heightened focus on racial injustice that we're dealing with currently. And then noticing what's different since we've been grappling with COVID, and getting a sense of a continuum of wellness, and that if there's certain things that we might start to look out for that would let us know we need more help, and that we're sort of more untethered, and then there's just a degree of ups and downs and untetheredness that we might anticipate and expect. I think this idea of being resourced and being grounded as a place from which to tackle difficulties and uncertainties is really important. And again, whether it's the uncertainty about what's going to happen with school next year, or am I going to have a job or not, or can I pay my bills, or what's going on with my kids, or are we going to make any progress, any real progress on dismantling racism and tackling white supremacy, to even consider those questions from a place of groundedness and resourced, and being resourced, I think is really important. And again, I think that's personal for a lot of folks to sort of feel into, how do I feel connected, grounded, tethered? What are all the ways in which I might take care of myself typically, and can I dust some of those old coping strategies off and really make sure to utilize them preventatively and regularly and habitually, and make space for that work to be tethered and to be grounded. And then also, in the moment, even right now, right? So like, this is a little bit stressful to do, to be recorded. And I know that if I'm able to be right here in the present moment and just be in a conversation with you all, and notice, some things, say, around my office, or notice some things in your offices, and bring myself right actually into the moment, and also take a breath, I can ground or tether myself in such a way that I can then think more flexibly, creatively, and with spontaneity. And that helps me kind of engage, or stay in this window of engagement where I'm not too panicky, or I'm also not sort of too checked out, right? So I'm able to use some strategies that could be very simple, like, one of the ones that we do often is noticing some things I might see in the room. And I sort of think of 5 things I might see in the room. And so I could literally just look around my room and say, books, light, plant, and that's bringing me right into this moment. I might then listen for, 4 or 5 sounds, and I might hear outside the building, a car going by, or the birds chirping. I might hear the heating unit come on, right? And so it's sort of all that to bring me right into this moment. I might feel, myself sitting on the chair. I might feel my feet on the ground. I might feel my hand on the, paper in front of me here. And by doing a really basic sensory noticing like that, I can bring myself into the present moment. And then that's often grounding, at least for that moment. And then from there, I may be able to tap into, using my breath to calm my system down a little bit more. Deciding, hey, I want to go for a walk with my kiddos or my partner, or pet the dog, or do something that also continues to help me feel resourced. Maybe I want to call a friend who I really connect with and feel that community connection piece. So I can feel more grounded and resourced and tethered, staying in that kind of window of being able to engage.
So then,
Yeah.
oh, sorry. No, I was just going to say, what are some age appropriate ways for children to stay emotionally regulated during massive disruptions like this?
Sarah, were you going to tackle this one, or you?
Yeah. Oh, Sarah, we can't.
Sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
Having background noise before, so apologize. I knew that might happen. I won't do that again. I love what Ryan's saying, and it's like, how do you take kind of that sense of grounding and bring it to little guys, and how children can do that. And a lot of what Ryan's talking about, I do with kids too. And so like they might need a little more direction around, hey, let's all be quiet for a moment. I'm going to put my timer on for 30 seconds or a minute, depending on your kid. And just, let's all be quiet and notice all the sounds up. And then we listen, and then, okay, stop. What did you hear? So it's a little bit more dynamic, but there's so many ways we can do exactly what Ryan's saying with little kids. Like with noticing the things in the room, I often play I Spy with children and just be like, I spy something yellow. And then they have to look, but guess what? They're getting out of their anxiety. One of the things that's so fascinating about our brains is it's really hard to be anxious and curious at the same time. So being curious gets us in the moment. And so if we can help elicit some curiosity with our children, if we're outside and all of a sudden see a bumblebee, because I just looked out my window and saw a bumblebee, over by a flower, and go, look at that. I wonder what that bumblebee is going to do. What flower do you think it's going to go to next? All of a sudden, the child's not in that anxious place. They're looking at the bumblebee, and their brain is able to access that. And that can bring us also there. And so basically a lot of like we use our breath a lot for grounding. And, whether it's taking deep breaths in, holding, and then releasing the breath. With little kids, they might need some visuals to help them with that. So it could be, I know a lot of the schools, they'll put a Beanie Baby or a little stuffy on a child's belly while they're laying down, and the Beanie Baby will go up and it goes down, kind of stuff while they're breathing. But it could also be, like picture your belly as a balloon, and we're going to breathe in and make that belly get big, and then we're going to stop and breathe out. But I think the biggest thing for younger kids with regulation is that they're looking to the parents, and using the corny analogy about the oxygen mask. When parents put the oxygen mask on themselves and they're grounded, that's going to be it's just so much more profound. I'm not thinking of the right word. For their children's experience. So when we take that breath, when we ground ourselves, it's contagious in a good way. So our children will start to ground themselves better. So I think if you notice your kids are kind of going bonkers, look at where you are. Look at where you've been in the last few minutes. Have you been a little bit more anxious too? And and also before we respond, let's bring ourselves into that grounded place, and our response to our children will be a lot more positive and healthy for them and for us if we bring ourselves to a more grounded place too.
I really love what you're saying, Sarah, and even this idea of doing it together, right? To be able, there's just one that I did the other day of catch your breath, we call it, where you make like a animal sound, like a snake, sort of a long breath out, and then was doing this with my 7-year-old, and then she would catch the breath and then make the same sound, and then do a different one, like a lion. Catch the breath. And it's a tuning experience, and like you just said, sort of having ability to both kind of calm and ground together and co-regulate, to then have a chance to pause and respond, decide, okay, what's now next, once we're calm and able to respond.
Yeah.
So you were talking a bit about anxiety and being able to calm down. Another parent's question is, how do we manage our child's irrational fears of going outdoors that seems to have started when we quarantined? Is this something that will resolve on its own? And how much attention do we give to fear?
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about children process information differently than adults. Their brains are developing, and magical thinking exists. Monsters can be behind the closet in that door. And if you say they're not real, they are real, because in a child's mind, anything can happen and be magical. And so I think we have to kind of explore these fears a little bit more and try to understand them. Another thing that's really important to think about with younger children is sometimes they don't tell us things. It's not because they're keeping secrets. It's because they think that if they think it, we know it too. So I'll repeat that a little bit because it's kind of a concept that not everybody gets. But young children, they think all our brains work the same way. And so if my child thinks I want spaghetti for dinner, and they're a young child, they'll think the parent knows that. And the parent maybe never heard spaghetti for dinner and does not know that their kid wants it, but the kid will think, a young child will think that. So that's a simple one. Mm-hmm. So sometimes children don't tell us their fears because they kind of think we know it already. Mm-hmm. They also don't maybe know how to articulate it, and it comes out in behaviors or in play or in these more bigger fears that they can kind of latch the brain, like kind of connect to. So what I think is really important as parents is to be a little bit of detectives in trying to understand what is the fear and what does it look like, because kids, again, have this magical thinking. And so when we talk about COVID, what does that mean to them, a virus? What does it, do, and how does it work? They might think it's like a storm. They might actually picture it that way, because how do you picture a virus spreading? That's a really hard abstract concept. So we got to think about what maybe our child might think is like it. And if we use an analogy, well, it's sort of like a storm, then they're going to think it's a storm. So we have to kind of get into their brains a little bit and understand that there's magical thinking, that they kind of think we know their thoughts. And also, a lot of young kids are the center of their universe. So they think that they might think that they caused it too, or they had some part in it. And it's really important for kids to know that this is not something that they did or any of it is their fault. But young children, and when I say young children, I'm thinking like that 3 to 7 age, and that could be bigger or smaller, depending on each individual child. But they do have a sense that they're the center of the universe, which means then they could cause it and then they can cure it. They also, being the center of the universe, think you know what they're thinking. And what was the last thing I had said? And then and that magical thinking that anything can happen. So that makes the world really scary right now. And our job as parents and professionals is to help them with those fears and make them sizable and manageable. I think I answered that.
Ryan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, I really love that, what you said, Sarah, about sort of really taking the time to be curious about what our kids' experience is. And to name too, that time is a bit of a commodity right now for folks, and that, this juggle of working or not working and having kids at home and all the things that we're dealing with right now. It can be challenging to slow down and find and prioritize and take that time, over and over potentially, to really be curious and to connect with what our kids' experience is. And it's one of the most important things in our days right now. So sort of naming, yeah, it's really hard, and it's so easy to just kind of go from one activity to the next. I gotta cook, I gotta do the routine, I gotta get the work done, I gotta this and that. And our kids are having their own experience right now that really does need our regular attention and curiosity. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So you had also mentioned kids not really talking a lot, expressing how they're feeling, sort of assuming that we know. Another parent question is, how do I get my young child to talk about her feelings? Since the school's closed, she's regressed to expressing her emotions, most often acting like a puppy. How can I help her express her feelings and not be afraid of them?
So it's totally normal to act like a puppy when you're feeling scared and little. It's so much safer for the kids use play. That's how they process. So remember, their brains are different than our brains. They're going to become similar to our brains, but at this point, they're just so delightful in the fact that they're play. They love play, and that's how they work through things. And so I would, not sure how it's all playing out, but you might become puppy's mama dog or daddy dog, and go snuggle up to that puppy and ask that puppy, "Oh, puppy, what's going on right now? What are you feeling?" And the little girl might go, and whine, "Oh, are you feeling sad? I wonder if you're scared about these things. I wonder if the puppy needs a good snuggle." And in her doggy bed, and then make a little doggy bed and snuggle up, but get right in it. I think as parents, don't be afraid of it. I think sometimes there's that worry, oh gosh, if we placate this too much, then she'll never get out of it. She will. All of these children will get through because they have you, and they'll be able to get through this really hard time. But being there, as Ryan was saying, it's being there with them. So it might be that you have to be a doggy mom or dad, and or for another kid, it might be a different animal. And that might be a really safe way for the child to express the fear. It's really hard think about how hard it is for us adults to express what we're scared of. And then here's this little kid who lives in a magical world. It's much harder. So it might be the easiest way to get that hug and say, "I'm afraid," if I do it as I'm acting as a puppy dog. And it might be easier for the child to accept what you're saying if you do it in this playful, "I'm mama dog" or papa dog. So, take what I'm saying and use that in other ways. So for other children who maybe are just shut down and can't express the fear, they might do it through play. Maybe it's playing cars, or Legos with little characters or whatever little dolls that they play out the fear. And what, as the parent, you might do is help that toy in character feel better and know that we can't erase the fear, but we can kind of help support you while you're going through that fear. But we do it through play. And that is generally a way a young child processes. So just remembering that play is normal and healthy way to churn through these things. For those also drawing, you can do drawings of it. If we had to, draw what fear looks like, what would it be? Would it be a big monster? Would it be a little kid holed up in a hole? How do you, draw it for the kids who are more that kind of expressive children? Use what works for them, I guess, whatever toy or medium they use to express it, because talking like this doesn't really work with little guys. You might have one very verbal, precocious child that does, but from my experience, most young kids do it in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and just sort of that idea of coming at the felt experience sideways a little bit, whether it's skipping rocks with the teenagers, shooting hoops, or going for a walk, or finding a way to approach what's scary, but not so directly.
Yeah.
To come at it in a playful, curious, age-appropriate, kid-appropriate, that person-appropriate way to get at approaching what's hard and scary, but in a way that you can feel into that it's working, and it's not so direct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan, another parent writes, "Thank you for doing this. It made me look at the stages of grief pie to better understand where I might be and where my children might be. I'm grieving my lost family time as my young children have returned to care. We quickly adapted to the change and celebrated its positives, which was acceptance with some denial. But as time goes on, we realize our current limitations and continually need to adapt new norms. It has been more challenging. Is there a piece of closure needed by going through all the stages of grief at each turn of events? And how do we do this at a flexible but quick pace so that we can be optimistic about our future?"
Yeah, great question. When I was sort of revisiting Kubler-Ross, the person may have been referring to Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, which we think of as denial, anger, bargaining, despair, depression, and acceptance. And there, excuse me, there's a sixth stage that's been sort of co-developed by this person, David Kessler, who had worked with Kubler-Ross, and this is finding meaning. And so this notion, that we don't go through the stages necessarily in any order per se, that we may circle around, cycle around, bounce around between each of those different stages. And B, that coming out the end, this idea about closure, I've really been thinking a lot about meaning. There is quite a lot of loss that people are experiencing currently in all sorts of different iterations. Anticipatory loss, we're not even sure what we're going to lose going forward, what's coming, we don't know. A lot of folks have lost income and identity and job, role, loved ones, our sense of what's normal and expected, routine. I mean, there's a lot of losses that folks have been experiencing. And I heard this sort of hopeful note in this question too, this idea of, how do we adapt? How do we change? How do we reckon with this idea that things do change, and that we do experience loss, and that impermanence is always real, but seems especially true and real right now. And how do we find meaning in our lived experience now? What are the silver linings? What are the pieces that we'll want to take forward from this really unique experience we've had in the last few months, where we have more time for reflection, more pause, more sort of ability to talk with our friends and our community about what they're experiencing. What meaning do we draw forth from our losses? And then what have our gains been? I think there's going to be some very interesting gains and silver linings to build into meaning making going forward. So I think, making, like Sarah was talking about with kiddos, I think is true with all of us. We need to make space for our feelings, to just feel what we're feeling. That's grief, is this normal reaction to loss and to big life stuff. And so making space for that, to feel it. And then as we move forward, to be curious about what meanings might start to develop, and how we weave those meanings into our next steps, which we don't know what that even looks like yet. Feeling that feeling, normalizing the loss, really naming it, and being able to talk openly with people about our experience and our loss, and being curious about what might come from all this, what meanings may come from all this, personally, in our families, in our social networks, in our communities. Those were some of the thoughts I was having as I read that question. Yeah.
Now, Sarah, here's another important question that I know all parents can relate to. How do I speak so my children will listen? I feel like a broken record on constant repeat. How do you suggest parents reconcile differences, considering child raising and regulating when they differ? Specifically, this parent is asking me regarding to screen time, chores, eating habits, like.
Yeah. Well, you know, this is such a hard question because it could be different for different families. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit broadly, and I'm trying to remember, as you just said it, I was forgetting about this before I did a little bit of prepping, but I forgot to look at how to talk to kids so kids will listen, and how to listen to kids.
Oh, yeah.
School book from, I think, the 80s. That's still so good, because it's like really, listening and repeating back and doing reflective listening and making sure that we heard our child correctly. And, but anyway, that's a great resource. But this is more about how do we get our children to listen to us? And I think part of how to listen to us is to start with, are we listening to them? Mm-hmm. So it's the nonverbal that I think I'm getting at a little bit more. Where is our child at right now? Are they able to listen to us? Are they able to process what we're saying? Are they too shut down? Where are they in their regulation at that moment? And we find that, I often think about the brain and where people are in their brain, in a sense. And sometimes we're really able to use our higher functions of the brain and listen and process information. And then sometimes we're a little bit more shut down, and we're just kind of in our sensory system and kind of can't process all that information. And then there's that fight or flight that comes, that, they consider that like the reptilian brain. And so when we're talking at our kids and our kids are just not doing it, are they a little shut down? Are they in one of those lower brain functions where they're not processing what we're talking about? So I think I'd ask that. A lot of times when parents come to me and they're struggling and they're getting into stuff with their kids, I say, where is your child's brain at that point? If you could kind of, are they calm? Are they relaxed and able to access what we're saying and asking them? Or are they a bit in that lower part where they kind of can't hear us, and we're talking and we sound like the grown-ups on the Peanuts cartoons, wah, 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 wah. Because if that's happening, we got to shut up, because they're not listening, they're not hearing us anyway. And then think about what we need to do to match where our children are. Mm-hmm. So Ryan used, I think you said attunement. We have to kind of be where our kids are, because they can't always come. If we're here and they're here, they can't come up to where our brains are. We have to go, oh, they're kind of down and they're dysregulated. We got to take a deep breath and help them ground so that they can hear us. Mm-hmm. So I hope that I'm answering this person's question.
I think so. So somewhat in line with that, talking about regulating things, a parent asks, considering that online gaming is a way for kids to connect in this time of social distancing, since they talk as they play together, do you have suggestions for healthy yet more lenient than normal ways of limiting this sort of activity?
Yeah, I was sort of thinking, like Sarah was just talking about what is the need that our kiddos trying to meet here through online gaming, say, and this notion of being social, of being connected, of having something to do that's exciting. Those are all good things, right? I mean, there's a need being met through that. I may have some judgment about how else they could meet those very same needs, but to recognize those are all pieces that we want to be fostering. And I kind of like this idea of some leniency generally during this time, and some kindness with ourselves and with others, and some spaciousness and appreciation that it's not normal times, and that we're doing the best we can to get through. And we may need, I'm hitting the chocolate chips a little harder than I might typically. We're doing some things that we might not normally do, okay, provided it's not really having detrimental effect. And I do think about work quite a lot with college students as well, and the presence of social media and screen time generally, to be cautious and cognizant about the potential downsides too, without limits, right? And that the screen fatigue piece, the notion of sitting in a room by yourself looking at a device, even though that does seem connecting on the one hand, the reality is on the other hand, we're not with another human or group of humans, that so much of real connection, I think, does actually happen with other people. And then I think too, when we broaden it a little bit from gaming to other online behaviors, being cognizant about the comparison of how our own internal experience is with what we see other folks doing on social media, and that oftentimes people feel worse about themselves when they compare our internal experience to what other folks are selectively posting as their external experience. And so at a minimum, being able to talk that through with our kids, and some of the upsides and downsides of online connection. There's plenty of upsides, and there's some downsides to be thoughtful about navigating as well. We're also online quite a lot more than we ever are, right? I mean, here I'm on the screen way more than I ever am. And here my kiddos are watching all this, so it's, they're mirroring what we're doing too. And how do we go forward in a thoughtful way and make meaning out of what we're needing to do to get through this strange time?
Yeah, another parent question sort of touches on being online a bit more. So the parent says, my child is very social and loves school, but he strongly dislikes remote learning. He's so sad that summer camps are closed and he can't go to the pool and swim and socialize. How can I make the situation okay for him?
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, this question gets at some equity issues and some issues around working with learning differences and access to, online learning actually working for folks. And there's a lot to talk through there. So that's one piece, I think. And then also the question about, making it okay for them. And we've talked some about this already, but this idea that we can't necessarily make things okay. But we can make space to feel what we're feeling, to talk it through, to find ways to really, appreciate the sadness with our kids. Yeah, it's really hard to not be with your friends. It's really hard to not go to the pool. Absolutely. Let's make some space for that. And are there some ways we can find other ways, given what our options are right now, to meet some of those same needs best we can? And even sharing, hey, look, it's hard for me to not see my friends like I normally would, and sort of normalizing the loss piece here, and to not have to make it okay to sort of brush aside what's our actual experience. And what we know is that when we allow ourselves to feel our feelings, they move through kind of naturally, like clouds in the sky. When we push them aside, avoid them, try to make them okay, they tend to come out in funny ways later, or come out sideways, right? So really just normalizing and making space, I think.
Yeah, Brian, as you were talking, I was remembering my guru is Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. And what, one of his favorite things to say is what's mentionable is manageable. It's really what you're talking about, is if we can get it out there, whether it's through play or verbalize the feeling, and I'm feeling so lonely, I miss my friends so much, and talking about it, it becomes manageable. Yeah, and so just you reminded me of that.
Yeah, yeah, and our kids don't necessarily have the life. I mean, they don't have the life experience that we do, and the perspective to be able to notice what's happening now, and know that there will be an end to this experience. And this may seem like it's going to go on forever to our kiddos, and so to be able to share perspective, talk about experience, name it, make space for it, starts to teach them. They too can get through hard things, and that becomes part of their life story and experience from which they'll be able to draw later.
Absolutely.
Well, transitioning a bit, one parent asks, what if your kids are starting to resent being forced to engage in activist activities like protests, sign making, or even conversations? We want to keep the values and dialogue consistent, as it has been their entire lives, while not making this a power struggle, a wedge issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the answer is built into that question. The power struggle doesn't often feel like a particularly productive way forward, and I think, like Sarah mentioned earlier, trying to tune in with our kiddos and find out what is this like for you to say we're going to be making some signs and going down to the protest in Montpelier last Sunday, and you don't want to go, you'd rather go do something else. Let's talk about that. Let's just make some space for that conversation. I think is really important, right? And I think too, just sort of checking in with our own motivations for doing the work, say it's protest work or anti-racism work. And I think there's really something to this of tuning in with our own experience and motivation, reasons for maybe wanting to make signs or go to a protest, and make space for that in conversation with our kiddos too, so that, we can find a personal motivation as opposed to, I should go and do this activity, or my community, my other friends are going, so I should, my parents are telling me I should, so I should, but really sort of tuning into what is in it for me personally to engage in these, protest activities, because I think from that place of motivation, there's a lot less of a power struggle and resistance, and that if we own it, I think adults too feel resentful potentially about doing work that we can't relate to. So there's a real piece of work to be done, I think, around why would I be engaging in protest work at all? What's in it for me and my family? And from that place of meaning and understanding and connection, I think it's much easier to sustain the motivation to do the work. And I think that's true for our kids too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And,
sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
The only other thing I was thinking about is if there's a way to get peer activity as well, and to get friends on board, and to sort of, do things as a group, if we can, I just know it's true for our kids that when we have other kiddos doing the activity, whatever the activity is, it's much more appealing than not. So that's just another idea to try to build community and cohort around all of what we do, including social justice work.
And I really think for children, if we're trying to raise anti-racist children and children who are gonna see this as a serious issue, I think the best way is to just model it. It's more, to me, them writing the signs versus them seeing their parents taking an active role is a big part of it. And why it's, again, we model, they watch us. they watch what we do. Sometimes they want to rebel against it, but they still take it in what we're doing. And I think that that's like what you're saying, Ryan, about checking in why we're doing it is such a big piece of it. And are we discussing even why we're doing that with the kids, because that's the bigger piece of why are we going down to the State House with signs, and having those discussions, and why it's important to us as the parent, probably will have a more profound impact on our children rather than having our child just make the signs and go down there.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, another parent asks, how young is too young to be allowing children to watch and listen to news coverage of the killing of George Floyd and the aftermath? Is talking to them about the situation and the subject of racism the best way to share with them, psychologically and developmentally speaking? What is the most effective way for teachers to communicate about these things with students that will not harm them psychologically?
So it's never too young to start talking about race. However, we have to take that in, making sure our discussions are developmentally appropriate, something that they can wrap their heads around, because remember, their brains are developing and they're processing information differently than adults. And there's so many wonderful resources for talking about race, the protests, why people are treated differently, how to be anti-racist, that are geared for children. And so I think we have a resource page that we're developing that will be a part of this, but if any, all parents, whether your kids are really young or teens like mine, I would highly recommend the Sesame Street CNN Town Hall as a place to start. There's this wonderful psychologist, Beverly Daniel Tatum, who has been studying this since I was in college, which was a very long time ago at this point, who just has wonderful information about talking about race with children. And really, they're noticing the differences in color. They hear things, whether we try to shelter them or not, from some of the violence outside. It gets into their awareness, and especially through social media, through conversations with kids. If there's older siblings, things will get to them. And wouldn't it be better if, as parents, we were there at the forefront having those discussions with our children? It's really important for parents of white children to know that you need to talk about race too, because they have to realize that there are people who are different. They see that there's people who are different, and yet they look different on the outside. They've been treated differently for different reasons, and yet we all have the same feelings. We all matter. It doesn't, despite the color of our skin, we matter, and everyone matters. So it is crucial that we talk about race. And I'm going to say this also as a parent of children of color. When white parents of white children do not talk about race, kids innocently say things that become harmful to their friends of color. They might use the N-word, for example, in middle school because they think it's cool, and not realize what it means, how profoundly that can affect the one child of color in their class. Because in this community, it is probably just one child of color in that class, and what that would be like. So if we really want to create allyship with people of color in Vermont, we have to. It is our duty to have these conversations with our children. So there are a ton of resources out there. We as a community group can also assist with that. And again, there will be some links to ways to talk about it. And I think, there's podcasts, there's videos, and there's tons of wonderful children's books on the subject.
So then how can we talk with kids about police violence in a way that doesn't erode their sense of safety in our community? How do we approach this issue when talking to kids who have family members in law enforcement?
Yeah, that's a great question. And building on what Sarah said, I think this is a specific question that fits into a broader conversation about racism and systemic racism and white supremacy in this country. And so if we've been having conversations right along with our kids about racism, and developing the skills to do anti-racism work, then this question, I think, fits within that context a little easier than if we haven't had those conversations. So some of the things I'm sort of thinking about, this notion of building awareness and agency actually as a way to increase the sense of safety, right? So that, I'm a white parent of white children. So that's really the lane that I can speak from. I know, though, that parents of color or parents of kids of color are having a different conversation than I'm having with my kids about safety in the police, for sure. And that, increasing a sense of safety in our kids is one of our jobs as a parent. Our kids need to feel secure, attached, safe, confident that they can trust. And there's a lot of places, including police violence, where the conversation is kind of complicated, right? And to be able to talk about risk and people breaking trust that a child might perceive. All police officers should be trustworthy. All teachers should be trustworthy. All coaches should be trustworthy. And then we start to have conversations that nuance that assumption and put some awareness into that conversation, build some awareness into that conversation with our kids. I think that actually does increase safety overall, for sure, because kids know how to take care of themselves, even when the adults aren't behaving in ways that we expect them to behave, right? So I think there's that piece that actually we're trying to build safety by raising awareness about, say, the dynamic of perpetrator of violence, bystander, and victim. I mean, that's a dynamic that occurs in police violence, or really many forms of violence, where there's an actor of the violence, and then there's a bunch of people watching and doing nothing. And then there's victim, right? And so sort of having a conversation about, where do you fit in to this experience of violence, and how could you really make sure, A, you're not being a perpetrator, and B, how do you really be an active participant in making situations less violent and more safe for everybody. And the bystander role, I think, is one that white people fall into frequently, and really are sort of standing by and not doing anything that's helpful or productive. And that's a role that we can really talk with our kids about, and can even broaden the conversation to, their experiences with bullying, say, and what do you do when you see a bully in the playground, or other times they've been able to see violence happening, and what makes it hard to step up and say something? What would make it hard to intervene? And how do we kind of check in with ourselves about what resources do we need to step up and to intervene and to say something to, mitigate that situation? And then other things I was thinking about was contextualizing trauma. We're talking about trauma when we're talking about violence, and there's a tragically long history of racial trauma in this country and violence, and to be able to talk about where current acts of police violence, racial violence fit into that long history. To talk about violence on a continuum too, that ranges from the microaggressions in a classroom or on the playground or on a school bus to, somebody dying at the hands of a person, in this case, a police officer, and that's all violence. And it also happens not just in the police force. I mean, that's this piece to really talk about, that the systemic nature of racism and white supremacy is in all of our systems. I mean, it's in the schools, it's in healthcare, it's in the judicial system, it's everywhere. So to be able to broaden the conversation and contextualize it has felt really important to do with our kids. You know, and I think this question about the, you know, if you have somebody in your family who's in law enforcement, to really be able to, you know, get at the idea that, yeah, of course, all police officers are not, you know, bad people or anything like that, right? I mean, that's this idea of contextualizing this experience, and to notice that there are, you know, if you had a family member who's in the police, like, great, let's have that person really be a leader in the police community to do anti-racism work. Like, what an opportunity. And you could really be proud to be having a relative doing that work. And how could you be doing that work, you know, kiddo, in your community? I mean, I think just lots of opportunities when we can check in and broaden the conversation. And of course, so many different situations, it's hard to speak generally, but that's a question. That's a very real question that's on people's minds a lot right now.
Okay. So Ryan and Sarah, a last question from a parent. How do we meet the adolescents' needs for autonomy and individuation during this quarantine time when there are so many rules?
You want me to start, or you?
How about you? I was just talking.
Okay. So, and I just want to say, like, that was such a heavy question you just had there, Ryan. It's so hard to really know all the answers to this, and thanks for taking it on. It's just to take a moment to realize that this is tough. This is tough as for us as professionals and parents, and for all these parents out here. It's hard to know fully the answers to all of this. So thank you. You know, so switching gears to teens, man, what a time to be an adolescent. You know, it's like you're dealing with all the sexual development and curiosity, and you're stuck with your parents and in your room, and it's hard. And we've been telling them, don't do this online, don't do that online. And I'm talking about, you know, screenshots and this, and get on these sites because they're not appropriate, and yet they're sexually curious. So there's a lot of this. They have to go against their norms right now of need to, you know, flirt with their friends and start being intimate, and then, no, but you can't touch anybody because we could spread the COVID. So you got that, and that they're isolated, and they have to listen to us when they're supposed to developmentally rebel against us and be more autonomous. So this is extremely hard for our teenagers. And then also, I really want to take a moment to think about our teens that are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, and how much more isolating it would be. You know, if you're questioning gender identity or sexual identity, or you don't fully have access to that community as it is, you know, to now be home. And so I just wanted to put out there before I talk about this much more, or Ryan does, that Outright Vermont has amazing resources for teens, and they're doing a lot of online groups, which is kind of neat because you don't have to show up just to the one in Montpelier. There's a bunch of online groups, and for many youth, they might have been a little too shy or didn't have access to getting to some of these groups because of transportation issues, and now they're online. And so I've talked to a couple of people about it, and the attendance has been pretty good because most people could get online. So I would, you know, highly recommend, if you have a child who's open to you about it, or questioning, that they don't feel that we do something to help with their isolation around this. We know that children in the LGBTQ community are higher risk for depression and suicide risk. So making sure your kids have those resources with Outright Vermont and other resources is very important. And just really acknowledging for the kids that, yeah, you want to be independent, and trying to think about what ways in this really convoluted situation they can exert some independence. Where can they have more leverage, and a little bit more bandwidth and freedom from us? And it might be as simple as they make dinner and they're in charge of dinner, and we shut our mouths even if it doesn't taste perfect, and just let them do it, and just be like, you did that by yourself, awesome. And how do we acknowledge when they are doing something independent and recognize that, and celebrate it, because they don't feel like they can do much right now. And Ryan, if you had some, you're working more with some college age kids, which is also really hard.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I think you said it really well. That recognizing that need for differentiation and individuation is developmentally where teens are at, depending if it's early, middle, or late adolescence, and that how can we support that development? And I see a lot of times with college students, when they return home, there'll be a regression in the way that the parents, will sort of start treating them as if they're younger developmentally, and then often the student will sort of act that way, or will sort of slide into that role. So again, kind of naming it's normal and appropriate, and what we want for our teens to be maturing and to be more autonomous and developing skill, and trying to make sure that we're not putting the brakes on that development, even inadvertently, and just being aware that, hey, it's a two-part dance here to help the kiddo launch. And it's a challenge right now when they're with us more than they might otherwise be. That's actually not that helpful in a lot of ways. So we need to be wise to that.
Yeah. Great. Well, you had mentioned that you guys are going to be putting together a list of resources for parents. You just mentioned Outright Vermont. Are there any other places or areas of resources that you can mention now for people who are watching?
Do you want to tackle this, or you want me to?
Oh, well, I think it's important if, I think sometimes people wonder, is this something I can handle, or do I need more assistance and help? And that could mean a lot of things. Sometimes people will need the resources of just their friends who've been through it or are going through it now, and to vent. And then sometimes you need something a little bit more. And there's a lot of therapists in the community, but also if a person's in crisis, or they're just really tearing their hair out of their heads, there's always Washington County Mental Health Services. That's a 24-hour access crisis line for any mental health emergencies. So it's really integral to, and also, even if you're not in an acute, like we're in crisis right this second, but you're like, what, we need some support. Washington County Mental Health is available, and sometimes they're just giving referrals to people in the community, and sometimes people could access services through them. So I would definitely say that. And also our pediatricians, our medical, the medical staff that we work with often are wonderful resources. There's social workers who work in the offices, and also contacting the schools. I mean, it's hard now because we're on break, but there's the school social worker and the school guidance counselor at all the schools that are available for everyone with when they need. And I'm sure I'm forgetting things, Ryan. What else am I missing here?
No, I mean, I think you said it well. There's also just myriad resources cropping up left and right online, in terms of finding ways to get support and to develop those resourcing skills that we were talking about earlier, whether it's meditation, mindfulness, but finding ways to really reach out for support, catching things early. We talk about the continuum of mental health and wellness. Trying to make micro corrections earlier is a lot easier than waiting until our hair is really on fire or we're really in a hole, and sort of catching it early, having the inclination to reach out for support, be part of community, get help, I think are all good inclinations to lean toward. And whatever kind of works for you, there's so many choices. Following that lead, but getting support, getting help, definitely.
Well, Sarah and Ryan, Thank you again so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge with all of us. It's definitely much appreciated.
Well, and Kristen, thank you so much for facilitating the conversation.
Of course, happy to be here. So thank you again. And yes, we will be with the video linking to where you can anonymously put in questions for future interview sessions that we'll be doing. So please do that. And thanks again, Ryan and Sarah. Have a great day.
Nice to see you both. Take care.
Bye.